Hey there. Welcome to People Count, a DiversIQ podcast where we talk about workforce, diversity, and human capital management from a data lens. DiversIQ is the leading provider of human capital and DEI data for the largest publicly traded companies in the world. We provide the most comprehensive data set focused on DEI, human capital, and other social factors affecting the materiality of company culture, employee retention, and inclusion. I'm Dan Berlingeri. And today I am joined by Marcela Pinilla, currently serving as Director of Sustainable Investing at Zevin Asset Management. Marcela, how are you doing today?
Great. Thank you for having me today. I'm in Brooklyn, New York, enjoying a wonderful spring Friday. So very happy to be speaking with you, Dan.
Of course, we schedule these intentionally on Friday. Everyone's at their best,
That's
you
why.
know, their best mood on Friday.
That's exactly right. I'm excited about the weekend. We have a whole week under our belt and lots to
Mhm.
talk about.
Lots to talk about, lots to talk about. Marcela, just curious for our listeners, would you give us a little bit of your background?
Of course. So I am now Director of Sustainable Investing at Zevin Asset Management, and I've been in this post for just over 3 years. And before that, I worked in the same space. I've been in this space for about 17 years now, working with different managers. I worked with an asset owner, Mercy Investments. I worked with a manager of managers at CBIS and at Boston Trust Walden as an analyst and advocate. So I've had training and I've gotten to work with some really stellar people in the industry. And so
Mm,
now at this job at Zevin, I do our research for our investment committee meetings, deciding whether we want to own a company or not, and what advocacy and impacts are helping us make that decision. We also do our advocacy year round, so it's something I'm involved in a lot.
mm, that's amazing. I mean, you have such a breadth of experience and you're collaborating with so many other companies and organizations.
Mhm.
What initially brought you to the work itself to do this work?
I didn't know, like the work as I know it, and especially on DEI, it existed when I first entered this space, but it didn't really have a name. So we've really come a long way voicing what it is matters to investors after we have really, as a society, processed what it is that we need to be doing to really track corporate impacts and corporate risks in a more and more refined way. Data
Mm,
isn't everything, but what brought me is I was fascinated by the intersection of business and sustainable development. That's my MBA that I got from the Heller School, was one of the first MBAs that combined these disciplines. So I think the the interdisciplinary, the the multiple threads and interconnected topics that exist in this space is
mm,
enormous, and we didn't really have great data. I wanted to be in the space because I was just, wow, here's a place that is fascinating and where we can bring some change. I could see how research and public policy research can equip an investor, and
mm,
how stakeholders who are at the front lines of the impact are probably the people who will best know what those solutions are. So
mm.
how do I link all of this and to find this field? And I've been in it ever since.
You're making a great sell for the field. Really great sell. You're convincing me. Well, fantastic. I'm sure a lot of our listeners would relate to that too. Just curious through your breadth of experience, what are some of the major trends that you feel you've learned from the space, or maybe some of the harder lessons you've had to learn given your experience that you can share with some of our younger to the career listeners?
I think, well, trends and lessons. I'll start with the trends. And like I was saying, data has come a long way.
Yep.
Investors, civil society groups, and with the SEC, with us somewhat sometimes moving towards more disclosure has made things possible where we didn't think it would be, like climate risk being an issue that's included in 10Ks is the effect of collective years of work, right?
Hmm.
And now the Human Capital Management Coalition and many others are writing letters to the SEC now to include metrics related to turnover, related to what type of employee are you? Are you contingent? Are you direct? And what are the statistics broken down by gender and race and ethnicity? And that sort of disclosure 15 years ago was not even something we could advocate for. We were very busy advocating for companies to disclose their equal employment opportunity reports, which
Right.
I think by now most S&P 500 companies do.
Yeah.
And that's thanks to, again, the collective efforts of investors, asset owners, and stakeholders. So I've learned to be patient. I think that, I think just over time, you do see that I mean, this is kind of a law, right? No action is without consequence. Every action has an impact, and every contribution that you make as an investor who is advocating for an issue that is material to long-term business success, you
Mhm.
start to really see the importance of disclosure.
Right.
Um, a drawback of that is that it doesn't end there, and
Right.
that's a hard lesson in a way of, no, we're never done. This work continues, and whether it's, and if you're an analyst and looking at companies strictly from a materiality point of view, we look at impact as well, right? And I think more and
Mhm.
more we're starting to see, well, what are the outcomes we want to see? Not just give me this data, but change it. Now that you can see where the gaps are, close them. Now that you
Right.
see that your frontline workforce is, you know, majority Black women. In the case of the frontline workforce,
Right.
Black and brown women are overrepresented. We know so much that I think it's a lesson that we cannot just stop at what we are asking for, because there are structural problems. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about like the headwinds that we're seeing.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Would love to.
like we're going to talk about that too, but lesson is like the lesson is that you cannot stop at disclosure and hope that, you know, things are going to correct themselves.
Right. Right. It sounds like, I mean, everyone points to the tired old adage, you can manage what you can measure, but truly, I think it sounds like the greatest, I don't want to say weapon, the greatest tool we have in this space is just getting more access to better quality data that you can then define as more tangible to companies, more material, coming back to companies with more specific asks and guidance and advocacy. I know that we experience that within all intersections of this space, whether it be sustainability, responsible investing, DEI, better human capital management strategies in general, internally in companies.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think it overall sounds like it has been a downhill snowball effect around the necessity for better quality and more breadth of data to work with, right?
Yeah.
Um, Curious to hear, what are some of the challenges, like you had said, what are some of the challenges you feel like you're running into over these last couple of years, maybe this year in particular? Um, Maybe some of the pushbacks,
Mhm.
um, and as it pertains to your work and as it pertains to the different intersections you spoke to as well.
Hmm. Dan, do you mind breaking that question down a little bit further? Like there's a first and second part.
Yeah. Yeah. Just I guess, first of all, from your seat, what are the main challenges that you are encountering, whether it be from the
Mm.
corporates you're speaking to, from your clients you work with?
Wow, it's there are so many areas I want to touch on. There's there's challenges that I think are like the election this year is a headwind for us, and us as an industry efforts to bring the United States on board to global climate commitments, etc. That's a definite challenge, and I think the retraction of big institutional investors and just efforts around sustainability and DEI have retreated. It's a challenge, but it's also a way to see that things are readjusting. We had this huge growth and mainstreaming of ESG, and now we have this separation of the wheat from the chaff. We're just trying to see,
Mm,
we're looking back and we see that big institutional investors withdrawing their votes on important proposals related to climate resulted in some really poor outcomes vote wise.
mm, mm,
That has had a chilling effect because that is the sharpest tool that investors have, to use their voice as a shareholder proposal. And if votes are going down, that is a signal. I'm not too worried about that in the sense that we are continuing our work. Shareholder rights are tenuous right now, but that's no reason to pause. That's
mhm,
not, or also not a reason to, go and fight back the anti-ESG. Their arguments are so baseless that it's hard to even fathom how to talk reason. So we're just doing
yeah.
our work, and it is it's difficult to I think we can just keep doing the things how we do them without really taking into account of this changing environment.
Mm,
So let me talk about the structural problems that I talk about that, or
yeah.
the
Not
inequitable workplace practices that
not
are
yet. Can I respond to that last thing you just mentioned? I just thought that was so, it's a really fantastic point. And I can't remember who said this recently, but probably a lot of people I speak to have said, that the evidence of friction or pushback is evidence of effectiveness, right? That like the more pushback we experience is actually evidence that our efforts are potentially working, right? Are yielding some actual concrete change. But you also pointed to this other point, which is that we've had this kind of, whether it be DEI, ESG, we've had an overabundance of approaches and strategies, this big, maybe, I don't know if it's an overinflation of approaches and strategies in the market. And in a way, we are kind of, maybe it's coming back, it's being challenged more, it's
right,
effective, and
right.
we're clarifying what is material, right? As a
Yes.
space, how do we point to impact more concrete, more tangibly? So in a way that has become a positive in sharpening that tool.
Yeah, I like that a lot, that we have come to be so important to the Republican Party as an industry does point to us being effective and to the importance of continued shareholder advocacy. One worrying trend is that, the big shops, the much bigger managers might have, all the good intentions of engaging and changing companies, but there's really not a lot of visibility into it. There's not a lot of evidence of alignment of their engagement work with proxy voting outcomes. And I worry that, as we are recalibrating,
Mhm.
that, we're all getting smarter. We all, I don't want to say we all want to be more authentic, but I think that's going to be the prevailing sign of a lasting presence in this space, is just continue to do our work and
Mm,
and be with the times and stay ahead of all the criticisms and discreditings. So
mm, mm.
I think it's a good thing too. That what I think is a little worrisome is that the customers or the clients or whoever's buying might not be catching up to this like expose that we have made of all these institutional investors. Like, look, doing, they're not walking the talk. And here's why. Will they get smart and make choices? The right choices for what is being offered, the value they're being offered.
Right, 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 right. These headwinds, they have such a power to shape and shift our trending market, especially on the precipice of an election. It's so hard for, I think, our consumers to not be pulled by the undertow of that, and swayed off center. You were about to mention the structural challenges that you wanted to address. Would love to hear more about that.
Yes, this is, present challenge, but also a kind of prevailing challenge is the structural problems in labor, inequitable workplace practices, job misclassification or job segregation it's a structural problem. So for one, I'll start with the structural issue and talk about inequitable workplace practices. And on the structural is first, companies traditionally they see labor as an expense. And so
Yeah.
wherever they're cutting, you'll see in the 10K, they're cutting wages here or doing layoffs here or cutting back the overall number of hours that will be given to employees. That just is not a sustainable business model. And
Mm,
despite, all this pressure, that's a structural accounting change that needs to happen. Until then, there's
mm,
the direct workforce and the indirect workforce of a company. And the only thing that companies need to report is their direct workforce, which might be, of a certain size, 100,000 people, but without reporting their extended or contingent workforce, where you might have 50,000 or 100,000 employees that are working for the company, but not directly. They're hired through a third party, or like temps,
right.
or they're a so-called supplier. So structurally, we're
Like
already
in the case of
like
Uber, where their drivers are contracted. Is that correct? Yeah.
exactly. And in the case in tech, it's very prevalent. Uber and Amazon and Alphabet and Microsoft, they all, they started with these. It's a structural thing because they started in a small space, like out of a garage, and then they needed to hire more people temporarily for certain things. But then that has persisted, and that's created huge gaps between the direct employee and the contingent employee who might be doing the same amount of work, but getting paid differently and not
Hmm.
getting the same benefits. So it's it's good for investors to note that not all companies are going to disclose. They'll tell you they hire contract and temp workers, but not how many or what pay
Right.
practices are there. It's an important question if we are really looking at DEI holistically and
Mm,
comprehensively. And the other thing I wanted to talk about are the inequitable workplace practices that are just a challenge for the success of the outcomes on DEI that we want to see. So for
mhm.
example, if companies keep non-competes in employment contracts for frontline workers, that is suppressing job mobility. A
Yeah.
non-compete prevents an employee from going to work to a competitor or within a within a radius of 50 or 100 miles. And this used to work for tech executives, but it's trickled down to the frontline workforce. And the job mobility problem and wage suppression is another problem
Mm,
because it's difficult to go bargain for a higher wage if you cannot go interview elsewhere. Typically, frontline jobs don't have a pathway to growth. So the economic case is there for why this workplace practice is not equitable. Removing this barrier would help unleash wages and
Mm,
facilitate job mobility, both things that are essential for reaching diversity, equity, and inclusion outcomes. So
it's
I have a
fantastic.
lot more to say, but let me pause here, Dan. I hope that that is answering part of your question.
Oh yeah, no, that it's I just your experience and your focus here is I so appreciate it. I think every every company and asset manager has their own focus and their own, secret sauce, so to speak. And you wear many hats. You do all your own research. You are in the weeds, you are on the front line, right, with your own shareholder engagement. So you see it all. So it's really great to hear that perspective. I wanted to comment on one thing on the contractor side. As someone who worked in HR, I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've heard from department heads who have used, discretionary budget to hire a few more contractors onto their team. The HR was completely unaware of, right? It's not regulated. It doesn't need to be reported. HR doesn't always find out about it until it's much later on, right? So it's a hard, we need to make some progress there for sure. We need to make some progress to measure it.
Yeah, and look, there has been some recent progress where the FTC actually banned non-competes. And
Wow.
so they're banned now, and that means that
Great.
companies will need to withdraw, rescind non-competes and employment contracts. And what is going to matter is the outcome of this lawsuit that the US Chamber of Commerce has filed with the FTC, saying that the FTC does not have authority to do its job, which it does. So investors like us we're gathering other investors to build up assets under management to submit comments from investors. So the judge understands that there's a very clear economic and business case here. And yeah, that's like I said, it doesn't end. So non-competes may be banned, but we're now going to try to keep it that way.
Excellent. Where do you see things going? I know we're reaching towards the end of our time. I'd love to spend some time on what your hopes are for this space, what your aspirations are.
Yes, I like this question because as much as there are headwinds and challenges, in the long term, I think we are moving towards being a better human race, being a better society. My hopes is that the work and the contributions that we make through Zevin and with others are going to help to continue to keep us on that pace, because we cannot lose sight or hope of what we want to see. Worker voice and
Mm,
the last year of unionizing has been encouraging in some ways, but in others, again, like the pushback from companies is enormous. So, freedom of association, you cannot have, again, a good DI without freedom of mobility and association. So I'm hoping that worker voice will get more and more integrated. And as Ellen Frank Miller founded a group called Workforce and Organizational Research Center. And she says that workplace equity and quality jobs, just the quality of a job, a good job, these are mutually dependent things. So you can't have one without the other. So with
mm,
that in mind, we need to expand our panorama to, move beyond representation of women on the board, for example, but to go deeper into what does a good job look like,
right.
and and take input from the people who know the solutions. It's very fascinating research, because we know that when you have better workplace standards, you have less accidents, you have less absenteeism. When you have higher wages, you have better outcomes all over. When you can call a good job, and have a worker say, this is a good job, that's when we know that we've
Mm,
done the things right. And I say we as all the people who have an interest in improving corporate performance on workplace equity. We are, I don't know what it will be called in 10 or 20 years, but I
mm,
do think that we're starting to articulate better and better, what do we want to see, what do stakeholders want to see, with the caveat that you cannot standardize something as important as racial equity, as the sense of belonging. It's
yeah.
you have to keep that in mind. Let the employees tell you if they're happy, and that's the best litmus test.
Yeah. Yeah. Worker voice. I to a spoke to a DEI consultant recently who said, your marginalized communities within a workforce are often or could there's an opportunity to listen to their work voice as a almost like a bellwether, like a signal of the winds and a health check on company inclusion and culture, right? They're oftentimes the first groups of workers who will sense if something is off. Yeah, I just think there's a lot of more progress to be done in terms of how we think about DEI holistically. And you're right, I think integrating in how we measure things like the E and the I will help us point to more materiality. We'll build a better case for DEI practices, for corporate governance in general,
Mhm.
for workers' rights. Will all the goals that we're chasing will again sharpen those tools even more. So
Yeah.
yeah.
And these, Dan, I'm sure your audience might recognize some of these, but retention and promotion of employees broken down by gender, race, and ethnicity is one way that we can see if employees, once they're recruited, if they stay. And then
Mhm.
there's the pay gap exercises that we ask companies to do, but then the workforce disclosure, the material workforce disclosure is important. So we're we're capturing only, limited scope of employees. So encouraging that disclosure can help us to then better understand the risks companies facing and to use our investor voice to channel up what what employees want.
Right. Expand the panorama of what we are looking at and considering. You're right. And some of the folks that we are working with today are looking at things like pay equity as one of the only, purest signals they can of a tell of company inclusion, right? Behaviors of inclusion of a company is the output of pay equity. So yeah, I that's encouraging to hear that
Yeah,
focus. Yeah.
yeah. And Dan, like if we're looking at boards and we want to see women and people of color represented on those boards, the next step is, well, how much is there pay equity among those voting members, and are their votes also having equal weight? There's always the next step to really better understand. Um, but yeah, those are some of the indicators that I believe you track with DiversIQ, and that it is really up to active investors to push companies to provide that information to the benefit of investors and anyone who wants to really understand the company.
Yeah, yeah, we do put a lot of effort into tracking and trying to expand upon that data set on human capital, particularly on pay equity, turnover rates, retention, new hiring,
Mhm.
internal mobility. Those are all the output numbers of a good culture, right? And how to signal that. So thank you for shouting that out. And we love partnering with you. We love partnering with Zevin. So
Thank
looking
you.
forward to continuing to do that
Likewise.
work. Yeah, of course. Of
Great,
course.
great, Dan. It's always good to speak with you, and thank you for your questions.
Of course. Thank you for your time today, Marcela. We hope you enjoyed everyone, for our listeners, today's episode. If you liked this content, there is plenty more to check out at DiversIQ.com. That's DiverSIQ.com. We have blog articles, white papers, and webinars on topics like this. And if you join our newsletter at DiverSIQ.com/newsletter, we'll send you all of those things directly to you once a week. Thank you so much for listening. And Marcela, do you have any final thoughts for us before we sign off?
I'll leave it with, I hope that everyone who's listening has good takeaways to take back to your work on social equity in general and DEI and racial justice.
Excellent. Thank you, Marcela. Enjoy your weekend.
Thank you, Dan. Likewise. Take care.